Apple has become synonymous with some of the most popular tech products in history. But before the iPod and the iPhone, Apple was just one computer manufacturer among many, and it took the company years to find their footing, as the popularity of the IBM-compatible PC exploded in the 80s and 90s. Today, Apple is a computing, mobile, and business juggernaut. But there's a lot of interesting history to the company that the average consumer probably doesn't know. Here are 10 things you didn't know about Apple. There's been a lot of speculation over the years as to how Apple came by its brand name. It's thought that the name was chosen in contrast to the cold, hard-sounding names like IBM, or even that co-founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak wanted their company's name to appear before Atari in the phone book. According to Wozniak himself, the idea came from Jobs after a trip to an apple orchard in Washington State. When Jobs suggested Apple Computer, Wozniak immediately liked the name, but was concerned about possible legal action from Apple Records, the label owned by surviving members of the Beatles. Try as they might, they couldn't think of a name they liked better. In Jobs' biography, he said that the name sounded fun, spirited, and not intimidating. The name stuck, but Wozniak's initial thought turned out to have merit. The company was indeed sued by Apple Records several times between 1978 and 2006, with a final settlement being reached in 2007. While Jobs and Wozniak are the two men most associated with Apple's founding, the company actually began with a third business partner. When incorporation documents were filed on April 1, 1976, they contained the signatures of Jobs, Wozniak, and Ron Wayne. Wayne was originally a 10% holder in the company, but his stake was dissolved only 12 days after Apple was incorporated. In an interview with CNN, the 81-year-old Wayne explained how he was essentially brought on to be the grown-up in the company, designing the original logo and mediating disputes between Wozniak and Jobs. Even though his stake would have been diluted when shareholders were later added, it's safe to say he missed out on a significant chunk of change. But Wayne has no regrets, saying there were absolute whirlwinds. I was standing in the shadows of giants. If I stayed at Apple, I probably would have ended up the richest man in the cemetery. The company's first product, designed and built in 1976, was the Apple I. It debuted at the Palo Alto Homebrew Club, a regular meeting of home-built computer enthusiasts, in a version hand-built by Wozniak and housed in a wooden case. To finance the build, Wozniak sold his VW bus, his only means of transportation, and Jobs sold his Hewlett-Packard scientific calculator. They soon obtained an order for 100 units from the Byte Shop, a computer store in Mountain View, California. Somehow they scraped the funds together to complete the $50,000 order, and delivered the finished product within about a month. The machine was discontinued in 1977 after the introduction of the Apple II, which would go on to become one of the most influential and popular home computers of its era. Many of the original Apple I machines were returned to the manufacturer and their circuit boards destroyed, making them extremely rare today. Apple would go on to be ahead of the curve by many years with several of their products and platforms. The original Macintosh, released in 1984, was the first consumer machine whose operating system featured a graphical user interface like the ones we are familiar with today. It was the first computer to ship with a mouse, and its window-based point-and-click interface was an obvious influence on the development of Microsoft's Windows operating system. Unfortunately, many of Apple's earlier products were a bit too ahead of their time for their own good. Released in 1993, Macintosh TV was one of the very first attempts at integrating home computers and television to reach the consumer market. The computer component was based on the Macintosh LC500 series, married to a 14-inch Sony Performa television display. The monitor could be switched back and forth between the computer desktop and TV broadcasts. While it couldn't display television in a window on the desktop, it could capture stills from live TV to a file on the computer. Only around 10,000 of these units were sold, but the Macintosh TV serves as an early indicator of the forward-thinking nature of Apple. For another example of this, look no further than the QuickTake, the very first color digital camera to be released to consumers in the US. In 1994, photography was a $12 billion industry, and Apple was determined to be the first tech company to take a bite out of it. The QuickTake was compatible with any Macintosh, with a later model also compatible with Windows, and it connected by a simple serial cable. Resolution was very low by today's standards. The highest available was 640 by 480, and the camera could only hold 8 stills at that resolution in its internal memory. You couldn't preview the photos on the camera itself, or delete individual pics. Only dump the entire contents of the camera's memory with a recessed trash button. It didn't take long for competition to reach the market, and digital camera models sold by the likes of Kodak and Nikon, brands that consumers already associated with photography, far outsold Apple's offering. The QuickTake was discontinued after only 3 years in 1997, and they're collector's items today, but you'll need an old Mac to use it with, because they're not compatible with OS X. Famed astronomer Carl Sagan rose to prominence in the 1970s with the original Cosmos series, on which he famously used the phrase billions and billions with a great deal of regularity, making this a catchphrase of sorts in the mind of the public. When Apple began working on their new Power Mac 7100 in the early 1990s, they gave the machine the internal codename Carl Sagan, the idea being that the new machine would make Apple billions and billions of dollars. When internal documents bearing this codename leaked to the public, Sagan took issue, fearing that it could be construed as an official endorsement, despite the fact that the name was being used only as an internal descriptor. In response to an angry letter Sagan wrote to the magazine Macweek, Apple changed the codename of the project to BHA for Butthead Astronomer, at which point Sagan promptly sued the company for libel. Unsurprisingly, the case was dismissed, but Sagan filed another suit over the initial use of his name, again an internal codename which was used only by company employees. This suit was also dismissed, a decision which Sagan appealed. Perhaps not wanting to be caught up in endless litigation with the astronomer, Apple settled out of court for an undisclosed sum in 1995. It's perhaps the single most recognizable aspect of all of Apple's products, the voice of Siri, the digital assistant introduced with iPhone 4S in 2011. Many of us can identify this voice just as readily as we would of family members or friends, yet we seldom stop to think about just whose voice it really is. While Apple has never publicly identified the woman behind the iconic voice, she came forward in 2013 to publicly take credit. Her name is Susan Bennett, and she's an actor who has been doing steady voiceover work since the 1970s. When Bennett took the gig in 2005, she had no idea her voice would be an everyday companion for millions through a device that had not even been invented yet. Bennett's voice work has also been featured in GPS systems and airport terminals. Voice actors like Bennett will record hours upon hours of nonsense words and phrases, leaving it to engineers to use the individual syllables to construct automated speech. If it doesn't sound like exciting work, Bennett would agree. She says, "I get extremely bored. That's one of the reasons why Siri might sometimes sound like she has a bit of an attitude." Before co-founding Apple, Jobs and Wozniak had met while working at Atari, the company that would give birth to the video game industry as we know it in the 1970s. While working at Atari, Wozniak had authored the hit game Breakout, a Pong-type game in which players bounced a ball against a wall to remove bricks. Over 2 decades later, Wozniak would include an homage to his beloved game as an Easter egg in the very first version of one of Apple's most iconic products. The iPod made its debut in 2001 and quickly became the must-have piece of tech for anyone who likes music, which is just about everyone. Holding down the button inside the jog wheel on the first version of the device would surprise the user with a game of Breakout, an Easter egg that fans discovered almost immediately. With the innovative backlit screen, a feature missing from most other MP3 players of the time, you could even enjoy a game while listening to your favorite music in the dark. It's easy to forget that only a couple of decades ago, Apple was hardly a dominant player in the tech market. Throughout the 90s, the company was involved in several different legal battles with Microsoft over software, and an agreement that was reached in 1997 might have changed the fate of Apple forever. In addition to agreeing to provide software for Apple computers, Microsoft also agreed to invest $150 million in Apple, which was losing an incredible amount of money at the time. This was done largely to avoid the appearance of monopoly on Microsoft's part, as they were utterly dominating the PC market at the time, a market in which Apple posed no immediate threat. Of course, 1997 was also the year Steve Jobs returned to the company and immediately began turning around its fortunes, pressing ahead on research that would lead directly to the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. In 2015, current Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer called the investment the craziest thing we've ever done, single-handedly saving what would soon be their biggest competitor from certain doom. To add insult to injury, Microsoft had sold off all of its stakes in Apple by 2003, 4 years before the debut of the iPhone, possibly the single most influential piece of consumer technology in the last 30 years. Today, Apple is not only a household name in consumer electronics and one of the most trusted tech brands, it is one of the most successful companies on the planet. To put their titanic financial cloud into perspective, we can look no further than the first quarter 2015. Apple reported that they had smashed their sales projections in this quarter, causing a 5% jump in the company's stock that added $58 billion in value to the company overnight, more than the total worth of the Ford Motor Company. The company is worth nearly $200 billion, enough to outright purchase roughly a dozen of the hottest tech companies in existence, companies like Twitter, Pandora, Groupon, Shutterfly, and Yelp, without even spending all of their cash. The iPhone and iPad continue to dominate their markets with no signs of slowing down, with every new product launch generating another enormous influx of cash. Perhaps nobody put it better than Jay Yarrow, CNBC financial analyst and former executive editor of Business Insider. Apple is the Michael Jordan of business. Enjoy watching it now, because who knows if we'll ever see this level of excellence again.